Hello everyone! In patch 5.8, Genshin will be releasing one new 5-star character, Ineffa, who will be our first character from Nod-Krai, the next major region of the game. While her actual abilities aren't anything we've seen in existing characters already, what makes Ineffa unique is that she enables the use of a completely new reaction, and her kit may give us a glimpse into the major mechanic of all future Nod-Krai characters. So let's take a look into her initial beta kit to see how good she is at the moment. But as always, remember that this is very early information from beta, so very subject to change. Ineffa is a 5-star Electro-Polearm user who ascends with crit rate. Her main gimmick lies in her special passive. When Ineffa is on the team, any Electro-Charged reactions are turned into a new reaction called Lunar-Charged, and Ineffa buffs the damage of this new reaction by a max of 14% as long as she has 2000 attack. So the big question is, what is Lunar-Charged? First, we should remind ourselves what regular Electro-Charge does. Electro-Charge is triggered when you apply Hydro and Electro on an enemy. When this happens, the enemy will have an Electro-Charged aura where they are affected by Hydro and Electro simultaneously. The Electro-Charged target will take Electro damage every second alongside any nearby enemies that are affected by Hydro. Each tick of damage consumes both the Hydro and Electro auras, and the damage will stop when one of the auras is depleted. Since Electro-Charge is a transformative reaction, it ignores defense, can't crit, and mainly scales with character level and elemental mastery. The character who applies Hydro or Electro last will take ownership of the reaction, and thus the game will use their stats to calculate the damage of the reaction. So if you apply Hydro then Electro, only the Electro character's level and EM will determine the damage. But if the opposite happens, then the Hydro character will take ownership of the reaction, leading to inconsistent reaction ownership. And of course, an anima unit swirling Hydro or Electro can trigger the reaction as well. However, Lunar-Charged works a bit differently. It is still triggered when applying Hydro and Electro onto an enemy, but when this happens, a thundercloud will spawn which will deal electro damage to enemies affected by both Hydro and Electro every 2 seconds. Unlike Electro-Charged, which can deal AoE damage with each damage tick, each Lunar-Charged reaction hits a single enemy. In addition, Lunar-Charged acts like a transformative reaction where it ignores defense, isn't buffed by damage percent buffs, and scales with character level and EM. However, Lunar-Charged can crit, meaning a character's crit stats can affect the damage of the reaction. But unlike other reactions which calculate the damage using the stats of the character who triggers the reaction, Lunar-Charge counts every character that participates. Lunar-Charge deals damage every 2 seconds. Within each 2-second time frame, the game allows any character who applies Hydro or Electro onto an enemy to take part in the reaction. Hydro and Electro swirls are of course included. So for example, if you have 2 Electro units and 2 Hydro units applying their elements onto an enemy in this time frame, all of them will share the reaction ownership. Once the game sees which characters are taking a part in this reaction, it will calculate the Lunar-Charge damage of each character using each of their stats with this formula. The first value is based on the level multiplier, so at level 90 the final value is 2604, then it's multiplied by buffs like Ineffa's passive that directly buffs the damage of Lunar-Charge, EM buffs, and other reaction buffs like 4-piece Thundering Fury, and of course crit and enemy res. So for every character that applies Hydro or Electro within 2 seconds, a damage number for the reaction will be calced for each of them. Then to get the final damage of the reaction, the game adds up all the individual numbers. However, only the highest damage number gets full value. The second highest number gets halved, and the third and fourth highest numbers, if there are actually 3 or 4 total characters that contributed to the reaction, gets multiplied by 1/12 before getting summed up. Thus, the character with the most crit and EM, or if they have special Lunar-Charged buffs, will be the main contributor for the damage of Lunar-Charged. So while normal Electro-Charged is a transformative reaction that can deal AoE damage every second and calcs the damage from one character triggering the reaction, Lunar-Charged is a transformative reaction that can crit and deals single target damage every 2 seconds while allowing all characters that apply Hydro or Electro within each 2-second time frame to take part of the reaction, meaning that its damage isn't calced from the stats of just one character. Now based on the EM buff of Lunar-Charge, Elemental Mastery's importance is more similar to reactions like Melt, Vape, and Quicken than the transformative reaction like Swirl. So while building some EM is definitely good for the reaction, you don't want to build all EM like an anima unit for instance. Now there is another version of Lunar-Charge that's being called Direct Lunar-Charged. This isn't a reaction that is caused by applying elements, but it's a type of damage that comes from certain character abilities. These have attack scaling, so the damage takes these multipliers into account, as well as all the other variables such as the EM buff that are in the formula for a normal Lunar-Charge reaction. But also, the damage is just multiplied by 3 at the end, resulting in a much higher damage number than a normal Lunar-Charged reaction. Based on early calcs, the damage of the Lunar-Charged reaction isn't actually that much different than a normal Electro-Charged reaction. At worst, it's not as good because some characters don't build crit, and at best, it's only a slight damage upgrade to a reaction that's relatively weak on its own. The more impressive damage numbers are coming from direct Lunar-Charge, but that's coming from character abilities, not triggering the actual reaction. So that's Lunar-Charge explained based on our current current knowledge of it. Remember that Ineffa's special passive enables Lunar-Charged instead of Electro-Charged, so all she needs to do is be in the party to enable this new reaction. One more thing about the passive, however, is the last cryptic line. Based on the Chinese translation, it states that at the rise of the new moon, perhaps you will receive an additional blessing. No one knows what this actually does at the moment. The common guess is that it is related to a core mechanic for all Nod-Krai characters, so we'll just have to wait and see what this mysterious text entails. The actual abilities that Ineffa has in her kit is very simple, as they are pretty much the same as characters like Fischl and Emily. Ineffa's skill creates an electro shield scaling off her attack, does initial damage on cast, and summons a robot that will target an enemy and deal AoE damage every 2 seconds. Just like Fischl and Emily, Ineffa's robot is an off-field turret, and it has a 2/3 chance of generating a particle every time it attacks and hits an enemy. And also just like Fischl and Emily, Ineffa's burst simply does damage and spawns her robot if it isn't active, or respawns it if it is active and resetting its duration. With her A4 passive, using the burst also allows Ineffa to buff her and the active character's elemental mastery for 20 seconds based on her attack. Lastly, while Ineffa's robot does deal okay off-field damage on its own, most of its damage actually comes from her A1 passive. Whenever her robot attacks and there are thunderclouds nearby, meaning you are triggering Lunar-Charged, the robot will initiate an additional attack. This damage is considered direct Lunar-Charged. Remember that direct Lunar-Charge is similar to normal Lunar-Charge where it ignores defense and is buffed by things like EM, but it also accounts for the attack multiplier and does triple the damage. So most of Ineffa's personal damage comes from these procs, meaning that she wants to be in teams that mainly trigger Lunar-Charge, which were previously Electro-Charge teams. With her base kit out of the way, let's quickly go over Ineffa's initial beta constellations. C1 gives an additional buff to Lunar-Charge damage after she uses her skill, giving the max buff at 50% at 2000 attack. C2 adds an additional damage instance after enemies are hit with her burst, and this damage is considered as direct Lunar-Charged. C2 also allows Ineffa's shield to be shared in co-op. C3 increases her burst town level by 3. C4 gives Ineffa energy whenever the Lunar-Charge reaction is triggered. C5 increases her burst town level by 3. And lastly, while the C1 buff is active, C6 enables extra AoE damage instances every 3.5 seconds, and this damage is considered direct Lunar-Charged. Overall, most of her constellations are just extra damage, which isn't very exciting, nor do they look very impactful in terms of overall team damage. The only promising one is C1 because of the Lunar-Charge buff, but only when they release a character who can also utilize direct Lunar-Charge as their main source of damage, for instance. Now, let's discuss Ineffa's potential build options. For weapons, her signature is her clear best in slot. Gives a ton of damage stats and buffs Lunar-Charge damage when the wearer creates a shield, so clearly a weapon made for just her. As for other weapon options, many 5-star stat sticks should be good, like Calamity Queller, Staff of Scarlet Sands, Escoffier's signature, Emily's signature, and Staff of Homa. ER 5-star weapons can also be useful, like Engulfing Lightning and Skyward Spine. For 4-star weapons, both Battle Pass polearms are good for damage, just make sure you fulfill the special passive for Ballad of the Fjords, and Favonius Lance is always a useful option for the ER. For a potential good free-to-play option, Missive Windspear looks fine to use. For artifacts, Ineffa doesn't actually have a proper best set. Remember that even though Ineffa is a turret character, her damage mainly comes from her A1 passive, not the turret damage itself, so 4-piece Golden Troop, while usable, isn't her best set. Currently, there are several options. First, there's Tenacity of the Millilith for the attack buff. Second, there's 4-piece Thundering Fury, because the 4-piece will be updated to increase the damage of Lunar-Charge. Third, there's 4-piece Gilded Dream, since the 4-piece gives attack and EM. And lastly, you can just use a mix of 2-piece EM and 2-piece attack sets. There was some info about new artifact sets coming in 6.0. This info isn't from a reliable source, however, so the details of it may just be wrong. Despite this, it is likely that a new artifact set in 6.0 will synergize better with Ineffa. For artifact stats, it's Attack Hourglass, Attack Goblet, and Crit Circlet. Again, most of Ineffa's damage comes from her A1 passive, which is considered direct Lunar-Charge. This means that damage percent isn't included in the damage formula, so having an attack percent goblet should just be better. ER wise, it's a bit awkward because similar turret-based characters usually alternate skill and burst for uptime, but Ineffa has an EM buff on her burst, incentivizing you to burst every rotation, but having to burst every rotation requires a lot of ER, and Ineffa doesn't generate as much energy as Fischl, so it's likely just better to accept that you won't have her EM buff all the time and alternate skill and burst for each rotation. Finally, let's cover Ineffa's potential best teams. Technically, Ineffa can be used as just a generic off-field Electro unit in teams that units like Fischl or Yai would be in. For instance, you could use Ineffa in a Dendro team for off-field Electro, an EM buff, and a shield. However, Ineffa does lose a lot of personal damage without Lunar-Charge since her A1 requires Thunderclouds to be present, and the presence of other elements like Dendro will consume any Hydro or Electro auras that exist, resulting in decreased Lunar-Charge uptime. So, Ineffa isn't really much better than other existing off-field Electro units in these scenarios. scenarios. Ineffa will mainly want to be in teams where Lunar-Charged, aka Electro-Charged, is the main reaction. For instance, Ineffa can be used in teams with an Anemo driver like Sucrose, Aoife, and Mizuki. However, because Lunar-Charged scales with crit and Anemo drivers build full EM and not crit, Lunar-Charged isn't necessarily better than regular Electro-Charge, which scales better with EM. Ineffa can also be used in teams with an Electro DPS and an off-field Hydra. Any Electro DPS can technically work, though they will generally have other team comps that deal more damage. The one team I have seen calcs on is for Chlorant. While Chevreuse Overload is still a better team in terms of sheet DPS, Ineffa does currently give a slight buff compared to Chlorant's current Electrocharge teams with Auroron. Lastly, Ineffa can be used with a Hydro DPS. The one calc I've seen is for Neuvillette, and again, his other teams like with Escoffier or Shilonen plus Kazuha look to sheet higher, but compared to Neuvillette's Electrocharge team with Auroron, Ineffa Lunar-Charged is a slight damage increase. And that's everything on Ineffa as of now. While Ineffa's kit is just a simple off-field Electro character with an added shield, the main thing that makes her kit interesting is enabling the use of a new reaction, Lunar-Charged, instead of Electro-Charged. Unfortunately, even though Lunar-Charged can crit, the reaction itself isn't a drastic improvement over normal Electro-Charged damage-wise, which is already considered one of the weaker reactions in the game. And in teams with Anemo drivers that don't crit, they may still prefer normal Electro-Charged. Currently, a lot of Ineffa's power comes from personal damage via her A1 passive, since it is considered direct Lunar-Charge, meaning it ignores defense and does triple the original damage. Other TC-based content creators have already mentioned the power of Ineffa's A1 passive, allowing her to have similar personal damage like Escoffier. And while this is true when just comparing personal damage and ignoring buffs like Restaurant and Healing, I don't think this makes Ineffa this incredibly strong unit with powerful teams when you take into account the context of the current teammates that she can play with. For instance, both Chlorant's and Neuvillette's current Electrocharge teams do get buffed by using Ineffa over Auroron, but it is only a slight buff in team damage because of Lunar-Charge being a slightly better reaction and Ineffa's personal damage. And both Chlorant and Neuvillette have higher DPS teams with other team comps. Ineffa will perform well and be a good choice in Electrocharge teams since there will be shield and a new boss that requires Electrocharge, but that's pretty much it. Ineffa's kit itself is good, but she doesn't really synergize with any existing DPSs, so she doesn't really have any team that she's amazing in other than when you want specifically Electrocharge for the content. So it is very clear that Ineffa is designed for future Nod-Krai characters, gear, and mechanics. Not only does her A1 passive have a line which we don't know what it does, but she also buffs Lunar-Charged damage, and while the reaction itself is relatively weak, direct Lunar-Charged isn't, and this gets buffed as well. So just like how Emily was released in 4.8 as a burning support, then Kaniche was released as a burning DPS in 5.0, it is very likely that in 6.0, Hoyo will release a Lunar-Charged DPS that can benefit a lot from Ineffa. Hoyo could make this character very dependent on Ineffa, or be more self-sufficient where Ineffa isn't a must-pull for them. We won't know until the 6.0 beta begins, and because of this, it is impossible to properly evaluate Ineffa's strength as a character, since she is waiting for Nod-Krai's release to be at full potential. But with the introduction of this new Lunar reaction, this may be the main gimmick of Nod-Krai, and other Lunar reactions may be on the way. But of course, this is just Ineffa's initial beta kit, so anything could change in the upcoming weeks. I hope this initial overview and analysis on Ineffa's kit was helpful to you all. I will continue to keep up with any significant beta changes made to Ineffa, so if you want to keep track of the changes, I highly recommend subbing to the channel to keep up to date with the latest beta news with TC influence analysis. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or like the video if you enjoyed. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.